Season reviews for some power forwards. Pascal Siakam and Obi Toppin's year under the microscope. Caitlin Cooper joining us to break it all down as we do on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Wednesday and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today, diving in to the season that was for Pascal Siakam and Obi Toppin, looking back with Caitlin Cooper for our player season review series. One stat, one clip, one over-under to define a player's season, whether that's a moment, a skill, a contract thing, a rotation thing, something. We dive into everything for those two power forwards who are both free agents. I'm talking right now at 6:07 on the 18th, which is Tuesday. I'll probably put this episode up early just because, again, at any point a signing could happen. Scott Agnes is reporting on the Pacers' potential agreement with Siakam. I haven't heard any details about that yet, but I'll put this up early so that if it does happen, I can just pivot into another episode. So said happy Wednesday at the beginning. This is actually going to be up on Tuesday late, but that is the path we're going with on this. Really good conversation with Caitlin. Really deep, detailed dives on both of these guys. I hope you guys enjoy it. You can find more details on these clips, the things we talk about, more numbers that you won't get anywhere else on Caitlin's Patreon, patreon.com/basketball. She wrote. Highly recommend checking it out. I've been a subscriber since the day she made it, and I would recommend it to anyone. Let's just dive right in, talking some power forwards with Caitlin Cooper. Power forwards for the Pacers. Last year, this discussion was about Jordan Nwora and O'Shea Brissett, and it was in like late April or early May. And this year, it's about a star-level player and a very good reserve that are both free agents. It's the Pacers Power Forward Season Review episode with Caitlin Cooper from Basketball She Wrote. We're diving into all things Pascal Siakam and Obi Toppin today. I'll say this in the intro, but again now, if these players are free agents or are signed, we can't control that. It's Tuesday. The finals are over. I don't make it happen, but I'm excited for this one. Talent at the 4 spot, Caitlin. This is not something we've been used to since Thad Young on these season recaps for the Pacers.
I was about ready to say that was kind of a bleak outlook last summer, but O'Shea Brissett's an NBA champion now.
That's right.
So.
I was dying laughing because he's been doing the vlogs. So he's like filming everything. So they would occasionally cut the camera where you could see him in the background. You guys can't see me on YouTube, but he's always doing this, like filming himself. I can't wait to watch it. Good for O'Shea Brissett, a good dude of the NBA. And we are going to start today with Pascal Siakam, the traded for man. The first round picks to the Raptors to acquire, free agent kind of for the Pacers right now. And Caitlin has the Siakam assignment. Where would you like to start?
We're going to start with the one clip. I'm going to surprise you, Tony, and where we're going to go on this particular ride.
Okay.
I titled the clips that I sent to Tony as inverted, which isn't completely accurate, but the reason the reason I wanted to pick this is it's from Game 1, I believe, against the Milwaukee Bucks, and Tyrese is being guarded by Patrick Beverley. It's an empty side pick and roll, and Pat Bev is shading Tyrese pretty aggressively to his left. The Bucks are playing ice coverage, so Brook Lopez is in drop. It's 2-man game with Siakam as the screener, and at this point in the playoffs, the Pacers were having Siakam pop out to 3 against Brook Lopez. It's a soft closeout from Brook, which is fine, because typically, the Pacers like to reverse the ball to the weak side. If Brook's dropped back, that means that the player that's getting it to go into a dribble handoff or a ball screen is going to have a little bit more space to play with. But that also means that the ball is being filtered to the weak side to Aaron Nesmith, and he doesn't do a lot out of that pick and roll possession, and then dishes it off to Myles Turner. It ends up being a late clock step back too. At the time, the reason I picked that clip is somebody actually sent me a question in my mailbag at the end of May and was like, hey, what else could the Pacers be doing with these empty side actions that Tyrese and Pascal are running in the playoffs to potentially build something else out of that, especially with how the Bucks and a lot of teams have guarded Tyrese this season. And at the time I told him, I said, I'd really like to see them pop Pascal more to the elbow area when Tyrese is being shaded to his left. That way he could throw it to Pascal at the elbow and potentially get back, have access to the middle of the floor by going into like a get handoff with Siakam at that angle. So lo and behold, they play the New York Knicks in Game 6 at home, and that's exactly what the Pacers did. They put Pascal at the elbow. Tyrese dribbles off the pick, throws it to Pascal there at that range, Difference is they can't go into the handoff because Miles McBride and the Knicks in this series were also top blocking Tyrese on any off-ball action, whether it was an off-ball screen, whether it was a handoff. So Deuce is preventing him from being able to go into that handoff. So Tyrese counters by then being like, I'm going to screen my own man. So you can see him being very physical as a screener, trying to sandwich Deuce McBride between himself and Pascal. Pascal sees that, rejects the pick, puts the ball on the floor with his right, and then turns back to his left to finish with really soft touch with his left hand over Precious Achiuwa in the paint. That clip was probably my favorite play of the entirety of the playoffs because it was so rare. I think there was like 33 total screens. I'd have to look at the number really quick that Tyrese set for Pascal during the regular season. So per 100 possessions, it was very low that they were running any type of inverted action. That didn't tick up a lot during the playoffs, but it did go up a little bit. And the difference that I really like there is, it was 33 total picks during the regular season, so 1.77 per 100 possessions. It was an area that the Pacers really didn't use
once a game.
Yeah, exactly. And it only, like I said, it only about doubled. So it still wasn't like a heavily featured aspect of the offense. But in that game 6 and with the way that Tyrese was being guarded throughout the playoffs, that mattered. And like the Pacers are known as being an egalitarian offense. Their movement a lot of times is how quickly they get to the next action is a big part of the reason why they were successful. But sometimes you want to keep the ball on the same side of the floor and you want to be able to put your two best players into action. And that was very high level problem solving from the two of them that you started seeing more and more toward the back end of the playoffs, including in game 1 against Boston when Pascal was being guarded cross matched by Al Horford. And I think that Pascal ended up setting like 22 screens in the reverse for Tyrese, and that was very efficient offense for them as well. So those clips I would title overall as 2-man game progression between Tyrese Haliburton and Pascal Siakam.
Yeah, and even as you go back to the regular season, like it felt like, and some of this was that there was a stretch where Buddy Hield was on the team and Tyrese was hurt, and then there was one starting up and another, but it felt like their 2-man game development came in like pockets. Like in this little stretch, there was all these stories about Tyrese the screener because he's saying, I'm the best shooter we have now. Like, I have to get better at this. And then that kind of fades away. And then Andrew Nembhard's starting now, and that looks different. Buddy Hield's on the team. And then it's not a lot of Siakam, Haliburton pick and roll kind of stuff, but it's coming. And then later into March, it happens more. And then they kind of do some inverted stuff as Siakam gets, but it never was like, it never felt like the 2 consecutive games you saw a lot of progression. It just kept kind of happening in these random pockets of time over Siakam's 41 games. And so to see it in the postseason when they need it to be awesome, you need to run through your best players as much as you can. I think that is something I'll be very fascinated about next season, assuming Siakam is back on the team, is what kind of are the next steps of their 2-man game and doing what you said and keeping it on one side of the floor, using each other and their own skills and the pressure they apply to defenses. What is the next step of that? Does it look kind of the same where just like every once in a while we say like, oh, that's new, that's different, or like, oh, this player is not or is involved? Like when they would clear out the wing completely, I remember they started to do that in early March-ish with those two. Like it just kept getting a little different, and that's what made it work and not work at the same time in the playoffs is the volume and speed at which it happened.
I think some of the reason why it was come and go is because of who the two of them are being defended by. Because honestly, like if you get into a series with Boston, which it ended up happening with Nembhard and Siakam by games 3 and 4, and the two of them are being guarded by Tatum and Brown, and you run a screening action, you're not really getting an advantage there. And that was the case sometimes during the regular season, where if they're being guarded by the 2 best wing defenders, not necessarily an advantage. So sometimes they had to pick their spots between, do we actually want to set a screen in our interaction, or is it better for Tyrese just to input the ball to Siakam at the elbow? And then what I really liked is putting Andrew Nembhard in the dunker spot, make a much wider entry point for Siakam where, maybe Myles is in the strong side corner, Tyrese is there at the ball side wing. And then if people do squeeze in in those gaps, then Tyrese is available to, potentially hit an open catch and shoot 3. So some of it depends on the matchups, but certainly in the playoffs where a lot of teams were toying with these different things, they found advantages between the two of them. And I like what you said too, because I think sometimes it's easy to forget that like this was a midseason trade. The two of them did not have training camp together. The things that Pascal did in Toronto, both offensively and defensively, are very different than the way that the Pacers approach both offense and defense. So to see that continue to grow, I think is going to be, a really big part of what they do together. And the fact that, like I said, it was that degree of high level problem solving, and something that I'm sure that we'll get into with both of these players. Siakam's, this isn't my one number, but it does go along with those clips, is that 39.5% of his shots were unassisted in the playoffs. If you compare that to Obi Toppin, only 11% of Obi Toppins were in the playoffs. And that's not necessarily to, degrade Obi. It's just to show that, like, that is an element at the 4 spot that they very much did not have, and something that they could go to, which certainly mattered against how much of the time sometimes the Pacers needed to play 4-on-4, where sometimes Tyrese was just, out of the action and holding gravity.
Sometimes too, I felt like in the regular season and a little bit in the playoffs, but not as much. It felt like when a Siakam Haliburton 2-man game would happen and there was a quick switch, like they would just back up and go, okay, post up. Like you're, just go take the guard into the post, because he's an excellent post scorer, right? And so getting into this stuff early really matters, and you can't just do it every possession, right? Like, but I do think that how they're covered matters just as much as what they're doing together. I think that's going to be really interesting next year too, assuming it's the same starting 5, is how much do they up the volume of that, if that is their 2 stars, or they continue to play the way they did last year when they had a top 2 offense. Like, you don't go away from that. But at the same time, if this really strong pairing of stars continues to get better, like how can you not naturally want to do more of this thing? It's going to be very interesting to see how that kind of all blends together. Hey guys, short little break here so we can talk about eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships like the Celtics is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you will always find exactly what you are looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers.
I think some of it is the story between Game 5 and Game 6 against the Knicks, right? Because after Tyrese got, input into action so much by Deuce McBride as a screener in Game 5, to the point where he was literally hunted more than he ran pick and rolls himself. And how much I said, like, they were playing 4-on-4, you go back to Game 6 in Indy, you knew that more of the offense was going to need to tilt toward Siakam. And Tyrese had a good game individually as well. But, that, for lack of better terms, that's the reason they brought him here. And he showed up at the times that they need him to. I think that they have a very hard time advancing in that Knicks series if Pascal Siakam is not on the roster. So I will go to the one number. It's just plus 0.977. That's the net rating for the Pacers in the playoffs with Tyrese Haliburton and Pascal Siakam on the floor. And just to break that down a little bit even further, because I was interested to know, I'm like, hey, they did have some lopsided games. Maybe, the one blowout win against the Knicks really skewed some of this. Maybe some of the other games did. They were plus 11.68 in 160 minutes against the Knicks. They were plus 10.04 in 169 minutes against Milwaukee. And they were also plus 3.62 in 53 minutes against Boston. That's obviously a much smaller sample size against the Celtics. But I think if you're the Pacers and, potentially looking to extend this individual, you're feeling very good that the Pacers won the minutes when both of them were on the floor together at the same time and against exaggerated coverages and in the playoffs.
Yeah, probably like the most important number for them to proceed, right? Like, obviously, when you make a trade for someone of this high of quality, the hope is that they'll fit with your star. And it's funny you mentioned that, because we talked about this with Turner. Like, how much better does Tyrese Haliburton make everyone else? This is, I feel like, the first time that the inverse conversation has really happened with a player on the Pacers. How much better do they make Tyrese Haliburton? And so that pairing being so successful against good teams, by the way, the Bucks and Knicks are no joke, says a lot about what they can do going forward, knowing that, okay, this is such a good pairing. Like, we can build out what fits from there, even if what they like already is the answer to that question. But especially against Boston, who they just lost 3 games in the postseason. And I won't be the guy who says the Pacers should have won X number of games against them, because they were ahead late in all of them. But the fact that they were able to be competitive was largely because that duo worked so well, and because Andrew Nembhard was sensational for the final 2 games of the series. But that says a lot, right? Like, they had to be out there. And I kept saying, we talked about this too during that series, every adjustment they make, they have to be able to score with who's out there. Well, those two could score against were they first or second? One of the best defenses in the entire league this season.
And another component of this is another way that Pascal helps Tyrese, in addition to those numbers being so strong, is another number I almost picked, which was 7. The Pacers were 7-19 last year in games that Tyrese did not play. They went 7-6 this year in games that Tyrese did not play. And a big part of that, again, was because they traded for Pascal earlier in the year. When Tyrese was dealing with the hamstring injury, they had somebody that they could lean into more heavily in a way that they didn't prior to. And to the point where, like you just said, Nembhard was obviously sensational in games 3 and 4, but he also played very well with Pascal Siakam in those games too when Tyrese wasn't available. And they gave themselves a fighting chance in 2 playoff games that Tyrese didn't play in. So another big contributing factor.
Can we make that 6-6 and remove the game that Bruce Brown went crazy against the Heat from the no Tyrese Haliburton data from last year? That one should not count. All the rest I'm fine with counting.
But Obi's defense against Jimmy Butler.
That's true.
Was probably his best defensive game of the year.
There were so many, like the first 2 games they played after that real hamstring injury against the Wizards and I think the Hawks, was like, who is this team? They played so different in those 2 games. Like, it was very strange how they were able to problem solve that. And that was pre-Siakam. Anyway, yes, that says a lot about that too.
And, I mean, I found it interesting too that these two, like Tyrese on, Siakam off in the playoffs was minus 7.2 on 139 minutes played.
Wow.
Tyrese off, Siakam on was also minus 6.6 in 220 minutes played. So we know that they got a lot from TJ and Obi individually as being, I believe they still held out by the end of the playoffs as the top 2 bench scorers in the NBA during the playoffs, but still, like, they were at their best when Tyrese and Siakam were both playing for the Pacers. So
Josh Green didn't catch him Monday night.
I suppose I will then shift to the 1 over/under, which I think you'll be surprised is not a contract figure.
Mine is, so good. I'm glad you didn't.
My 1 number is, let me go down so that I have it exactly right. 30.3. And that is his free throw attempt rate for next season.
Ooh.
Would you take the over or the under? And just as a frame of reference, that is his career free throw attempt rate. For the Pacers this year, it was 26.7%, which is the lowest it's been since his 2nd season in the NBA.
Now that is fascinating. Okay, I'm just doing some lazy numbering, if you don't mind. So this is 2 interesting stats in tandem to me, is that his free throw rate with the Pacers was the lowest it's been since 2017-18 with Toronto. And yet his average shot distance was below 10 for the first time since 2018-19. So he's still playing and shooting in the paint, but not drawing contact. There's a little bit of, there's like a lot of guys you could pick, but I always use the same example of TJ Warren to him, where he is very much an avoid contact finisher and not a play through it or try to play through it. So I don't necessarily think it's like a very high cap, like his free throw rate's going to skyrocket next year because he's just going to attack the rim a bunch. Jeez. I'd probably take slightly over that, but not by much. Like 31.
I would like to take the over because something we didn't talk about is his above the break 3-point accuracy dropped precipitously in the playoffs. It went from 35.3% down to 22.6%. Still shot the ball well on corner threes. His pull-up mid-range rate actually went up a little bit in the playoffs, despite the fact that he hit those at a very high clip with the Pacers. But there was about, a 6-game stretch toward the end of the Bucks series after he'd been guarded by Lopez to the beginning of the Knicks series where I hesitate to use this word, but he looked a little hesitant to get to the free throw line because he wasn't making free throws there.
Missing a lot of them. Yeah.
So it looked like he was almost avoiding contact a little bit, despite the fact that a lot of times as a player, he treats the paint like a war zone. And that isn't normally something that he does. And to his credit, he came out of it. That free throw shooting slump turned around for him. I think that he ended up shooting, I forget what it was after that little bit of a slump, but he obviously had the 7 of 9 performance against the Knicks. And from then on out, it was okay. But like I said, during that 6-game stretch, he only got to the restricted area. His shot distribution was 30.4%. So he was getting to that area a little bit less. So I actually think this is going to be one of the most telling numbers for him, both making the free throws and how often he gets there. And to explain why, I get asked this question a lot about, the Pacers and how do they have so many drives per game and they're constantly getting 2 feet in the paint, but they don't attempt near as many free throws as their opponents. As for Pascal's sake, what you just cited about his shot distance, I looked up, and his percentage of help on drives with the Raptors this year before he got traded was 69.8%. He was seeing a help defender. With the Pacers, that dropped to 58.4%. So some of those alignments that I just mentioned, like when you can put Nembhard as a guard in the dunker spot, obviously Boston did a lot with the dunker spot and guards. OKC does a lot with the dunker spot and guards. Like beneficial because then a guard is your rim protector, but also it's creating a wider gap. And there's no feasible way to do that on the Toronto Raptors. What are you doing with Jakob Poeltl if you put, like Dennis Schroeder in the dunker spot? Like there's no way to do that. So Pascal was seeing less help, and he's very good at beating the defender right in front of him and oftentimes spinning around the defender right in front of him. So it isn't completely shocking that his free throw attempt rate went down a little bit when he wasn't banging into multiple bodies with what the spacing situation was there by comparison to what it was with the Pacers. But I am going to be keeping an eye on how often he gets to the free throw line, in part because it did look like his overall free throw conversion rate, there was a portion of the playoffs where that was affecting his willingness to get to the free throw line.
Well, I talked privately with somebody after the games in New York when he was at, so I just looked it up. First 8 games of the playoffs, he was at 43.8%. Like, that's like hecka level of bad. Like, put in Precious Achiuwa, foul him 5 times. Like, it was brutal before he had that breakout kind of part of it. The reason it didn't hit as hard, and this is something I think that will matter for maybe this number next year, is he's so good from the elbows or from even long 2 range that you're okay with, if you're the Pacers, with him taking that shot. So it's not like he's going to stop doing it, right? I think for last year he was 50% on long 2s, and like that might not hold, but every year of his career for the last 4 years he's been at 45% or better from like 10 to 16. That's fine. That's a good shot a lot of the time. So you don't necessarily need him to be like, go to the rim all the time, drive, but it does help to do that because free throws are good, even if you're a 70 whatever percent free throw shooter. I'm inclined to not by much though. And I think as his game kind of ages, again, assuming he's still on the team, as his game kind of ages, I think he'll take more jumpers, but I think it will be this year slightly over 30.3, but not by much.
I think another point that should be added on is everything that you just said, is that if anybody's nervous about the Pacers signing Pascal to potentially a very lucrative multi-year deal in the coming days, weeks, whenever that occurs, I think that his game's going to age pretty well for the reasons that you just said. So other than, because we didn't talk about it and I didn't put it in any numbers or anything else here, I went into Pascal's defense with the Pacers with lower expectations probably than most, because I do a lot of crossover content with people who cover the Raptors, obviously. But I do think that I should point out that in Game 4 of an elimination game, as I've mentioned many times on these podcasts, Pascal was not guarding Jaylen Brown or Jason Tatum. And the series against the Knicks, there was not even a consideration that Pascal would be put on Jalen Brunson, despite the fact that the best Jalen Brunson defenders are typically wings with length who can still contest when he creates the amount of separation that he creates. He was not guarding Chris Middleton in the first series against the Bucks. So in terms of the Pacers still needing a wing-sized wing who they can throw against those types of options, Pascal didn't answer that question, despite the fact that he did fill a lot of the other voids that they needed to in the ways that I've shown and described here.
Yeah, I viewed him as a higher level defender than he was for the Pacers when he got to Indiana. Maybe it's just because I was at this game, but I remember thinking they played the Magic. They won that game in Orlando. And I was like, oh, that was one of his best defensive games so far to me. And it sticks out, 1, because it was good, but 2, because it was his 24th game with the team. Like, it took a while for it to really.
Another reason why that game probably stands out
is that when they started switching big, and he would get
because
on
Pascal was guarding Banchero, and anytime there was a 4-5 pick and roll, they switched it because they didn't have as much concern with Myles switching out against Wagner or Banchero. But when you're against Boston, as we saw in Game 4, there's more concern with Myles switching out to Tatum and Brown.
Yeah. Well, I remember that too, because we were so close to the court with our media seats, you could hear him. And he had one switch with Isaiah Jackson that went wrong, horribly wrong. And they just both started like pointing. And I was like, oh, they're doing something different with Pascal on defense, clearly, because someone was very confused on what just happened.
It was Isaiah's fault. That's why Pascal pushed him. He's like, we're
switching. You remember the play? That's crazy.
Yeah, it was. I remember that vividly because I wrote a piece about it. Because I'm like, finally, like, this is what Pascal needs to be a switch defender in both cases. And we'll get into it with Obi as well, because neither of them, like, this is their games are so polar opposite different, but the one thing they have in common, despite playing the same position, is that neither of them are somebody that you really want to put against top wing options right now. Right. But the one thing that Siakam does that Toppin doesn't is that if Siakam is the screener defender, I feel okay with him switching out to the ball and being able to be in contain better than Obi. But like, I'll be honest here, like finding the right defensive role for Siakam was a journey for the Pacers, and it's something that I still don't fully know. Like there were games in the playoffs where, you know, he was helping off of Precious Achiuwa. He was helping off of Josh Hart. He was providing a shadow presence, and that allowed Aaron Nesmith to play much tighter to Jalen Brunson than what Andrew Nembhard could do in the prior 2 games before they made that adjustment. So there are times where I like Siakam as a roamer, but that isn't even perfect for him. So the pieces around him, like Jenny Busick as the defensive coordinator, Jim Boylan as the defensive coordinator, like I think sometimes people look at the Pacers roster and think that the defensive personnel, that the Pacers should be getting a lot more out of it than they are. And a lot of times I look at it and think this is like solving a Rubik's Cube in terms of getting all of these people into the right spots because of like what we just said. Like the way that Pascal needs to defend is the opposite of the way that Myles needs to defend and vice versa. Like it can be challenging.
I said for a while that the biggest defensive impact Pascal had nothing to do with him and had everything to do with his size, because then Aaron Nesmith was not guarding giant people. Like Andrew Nembhard was not guarding giant people. And so those two were more effective, and that made the team more effective, even if Pascal himself was not that effective defensively. Like those two were just better on the end of the floor. That's what I think it was. But, you know, obviously we can see what happens with that next year. But I mean, everybody remembers the game right before the trade. Nembhard guarded Lauri Markkanen, and it was the best option they had.
Yeah. Lauri and Buddy. I mean, Buddy was guarding Giannis at times. But, I mean, the fact of the matter is they went to New Orleans, and do you remember who Pascal was guarding, Tony? To start that game?
Herb Jones? Oh, to start? No, I don't.
Jonas Valanciunas. They had Myles on Zion Williamson, and they had Aaron Nesmith on Brandon Ingram. There was just a lot of games that you could point to and be like, okay, like they have Pascal as a wing-sized defender, and he's not doing it. And some of that's because of how much value and importance he brings offensively, but also it's because like, oh, we don't really want Pascal chasing Brandon Ingram over the top of the screen.
That was one of the most
despite the fact that Brandon Ingram scored 19 on Aaron Nesmith
in 2 seconds of that game. That was ridiculous. Someone texted me and was like, is this score right? It's like, yes.
Don't have a defensive rebound in
every possession they took a shot, they scored for a whole quarter. It's unbelievable. That was the most controversial thing we said before the season last year. Do you remember that? You asked me for an over-under of 20th for defensive rating, and we both said over, and everybody was like, oh, they got Bruce Brown. They should be better, and they were not. They were decidedly not.
No, I mean, for a large portion, they were actually probably worse.
Hey, they finished 24th, and that's
yeah. I mean,
progress.
I mean, and some of that too was like Pascal does provide more size as an off-ball defender, and I think that matters at times. But also, like, no offense, but they were playing Nembhard and Nesmith instead of Buddy and Mathurin.
Yes,
like, more better defenders is generally good.
One more break here, guys, so we can talk about the lovely folks over at FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, my favorite. The finals are over. NHL Stanley Cup, though, all of it, all the best. The WNBA, it's all over there on FanDuel for you to bet on. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. $200 you can use to bet on everything from MVPs of series to who's going to hit one out of the park to scoring, over-unders, props, money lines, whatever you like. FanDuel, of course, has it. And if you visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, you'll get that offer and add a big win to your summer bucket list. Again, that's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. On that note, let's talk about Obi Toppin. Obi Toppin, what a strange and interesting season, because the standout thing that everybody talked about with him, this is what I wrote about with him too, was, oh my gosh, this transition fit next to Tyrese Haliburton. Tyrese Haliburton tweets the second the trade is leaked, wow, it's going to be like Patrick Mahomes and Tyreek Hill. And then Obi spent most of the season not starting next to Tyrese Haliburton and was more effective because, man, did his shot come along in a meaningful way this season. And I did not see that coming at all, which was absolutely huge for his ability to fit in with the Pacers. And that's where I'm starting, is with that in my clips, for 2 reasons. One, because of what it allowed Toppin to do beyond his shot. And 2 is because he's very good at a niche thing that I just want to talk about. Obi Toppin is the only player that I can think of that gets on his tippy toes for his shot fakes. And I don't know why he does that, but it works. It makes guys more likely to jump at him in some ways. And so both of my clips are Obi catching from three. One's against the Knicks in the postseason, gets on his tippy toes, defender flies by him, he dribbles in, hits a three from the corner. The other one's against the Raptors in the regular season. Same thing, catches on the left wing, shot fakes, defender jumps, lunges at him, puts it on the floor, drives, and dunks. So two things. One, his technique on those is very cool. And I find that to be endlessly fascinating, that he's able to go from on his tiptoes to on the move forwards very quickly. But the other factor of that is those don't work at all if his shot doesn't come. No one is maybe sometimes, occasionally in the regular season, but that first one's in the postseason. Like, no one is biting on that pump fake for the shooter he was before this, right? Prior to this season, he had 2 seasons barely over 30% and then 34. He was 32.5% this year on more volume per minute play, about the same. He was at over 40, right? The only guy in the league, right, who was at over 70 from 2 and over 40 from 3. That mattered so much on how he was defended and made him a much better half-court fit than I foresaw entering the season. And it helped him not only with the 3, but with the rest of the shots because of the way he was defended. He was far from the basket.
Yeah, because, I mean, the fact of the matter is when he left the Knicks, it was very easy to make the argument on behalf of the Knicks that, like, hey, he's attempting more threes than ever. He's screening less than ever. He's getting fewer paint touches than ever. If that's the role that Tibbs is going to use him in, then it just makes more sense to give those minutes to Dante DiVincenzo.
Right.
And for most intents and purposes, the Knicks probably still feel that way. And if you look at the Pacers, though, like, I anticipated that, like, he might be used as a screener a little bit more because he will be out there with Tyrese and TJ. Like, maybe he will get more paint touches, and it turns out he did. Like, he was slightly used more as the screener, and certainly, like, in Game 6 against the Bucks series when I thought, he was pretty much majestic, like, great game from him. He did have, like, a little push shot in the lane where he is used as the roll man. Like, even the most optimistic Knicks fans watching that were like, hey, this is all coming together. But as you mentioned, like, his three-point attempt rate, while not as high as his final season with the Knicks, was quite high. And the reason why that worked is because of the work that he put in on his shot. And also, like, it wasn't just standstill threes. Like, Some of it was him sprinting in transition and being able to find that balance to stay on balance and let the ball go, which is a big thing because of how angular he is. And then also, like, there were a few occasions where you might see him, move uphill. Like, I will say that, like, I would like to see what his flyby closeout rate is, because I do think that you're right that he is good at drawing those, but he's somewhat similar to Nesmith in that, like, I think 90% of his threes were without a dribble this year. So he's still not going to necessarily completely leverage that. I don't think his drive rate was super high either.
Not at all.
Particularly in the playoffs. Like, it's like 5 drives per 100 possessions or something like that. But the fact that he was able to hit spot up threes and there was a reaction to it, where teams weren't like, hey, we're going to sag way off of Pascal, off of Toppin when he's standing in the corner. Like, yeah, I think that he deserves a lot of credit for the work that he put in that regard.
Yeah, and I don't know what you constitute or what anyone constitutes as a drive per se, but, like, he would occasionally break out like a one dribble move and then take an elbow jumper or a shot in the paint. And every time I'd go, whoa. And then I'd be like, oh yeah, that's like all he did at Dayton. It was like that exact shot. Like, that's what he got to the NBA being a master of. But, like, his percentages from those ranges are okay. It seems natural to me that, similar to with Nesmith, although different in practice because of the way they move and the shots they get, like, if he can run guys off the line, like, he was amazing in the paint this season and, like, pretty good from short mid-range. Like, if that's a thing where he can shoot well enough to add a counter to the way he's defended, that's huge. It's just the fact that I was always surprised when it happened says a lot about how infrequently it happened, even though it's not like something he's never done before in his life. So I'll be curious how much he mixes that in, especially as maybe, like, Pascal shooting from those ranges makes it a bigger part of the Pacers offense, but they would get to that shot in way different ways.
Yeah, because, I mean, Obi was definitely an elite play finisher. It's just that most of it is play finishing, and that's why these two guys are so different, because I think that you could word it as Obi definitely built out their strengths, and Pascal filled some of their voids.
Yes.
That's the way that I would look at them differently, because, like I said, Obi, his unassisted made field goal percentage was 11%, which was even lower than Ben Shepherd's during the playoffs. So, but on the other hand of that, he was the first Pacer in Pacers history to have 100 dunks and 100 made threes. That was my favorite stat to track, because he was off by like 3 dunks headed into the final game against the Hawks, and he
perfect
made it.
Opponent.
Yeah, and, like, the only other 2 players in the NBA who did that this year, like, it's harder than you think. So Wemby and Chet did it, and obviously those aren't 3,
well, that's the big 3 right there.
The closest player I think for the Pacers that got there is Jermaine O'Neal, and the Davises had over 100 dunks, but none of them are even close to having 100 threes. But Paul George had 71 dunks one of the seasons that he was there. So that would have been about the closest. So having somebody, especially in this type of an offense, who can do those two things in particular, definitely fit what they were doing. And like you said, like he ended up playing off the bench. I think a lot of his minutes still end up being somewhat tethered to Tyrese.
Sub every game. Yeah.
Because Tyrese was playing a lot of those minutes with TJ coming in. So there was like a swing of like 4% for Obi on twos where he did shoot better when he got the ball from Tyrese. But it ended up being pretty seamless. Like obviously he and TJ were two of the best bench scorers in the NBA in the playoffs. So.
And we can nitpick these counters, but like he finished third in the league in true shooting this season, right? Like it's not like this place he finished were pathetic. And the thing that stands out about that specifically is of the top 10, he had the second highest 3-point attempt rate this past season. One of only two guys over 40. All of them are centers. Kelly Olynyk's kind of a center. Grayson Allen beat him, and that says a lot about Grayson Allen and how well he shot from three this year, that he finished second in true shooting percentage. But like Obi's in that group. It was Gafford, who never missed a shot ever, I think, when I watched the Mavs in the regular season. Grayson Allen and Obi. So like, yeah, there's every player can make progress and like get better counters to defenders, but he was still a wonderful play finisher. And that changed how he was guarded in a meaningful way, because I remember it, like every discussion, it felt like last summer when talking about the Pacers free agency was like, whoa, Bruce Brown and Obi Toppin were top whatever in transition finishing last year. And that's our style. And it's going to be great. And it's like, okay, but what, like that's part of the game, but like they have to fit in the half court too. I thought Obi did a better job than Bruce of evolving in that aspect of playing with the Pacers, which was significant to me.
Certainly, because I mean, you can look at the series that the Knicks played against the Heat, where like they were using Mitchell Robinson to stand in the dunker spot, and Obi would run off of him because he was so often being guarded by Duncan Robinson as the weakest, offensive threat. And he would run off of Mitchell Robinson in the dunker spot to get to the corner. And to his credit, he had worked on being a quicker trigger 3-point shooter, but a lot of times defenders weren't following him through those exit screens. And now when he was coming off of exits with the Pacers, there was gravity there. Like the defender was following him. So yeah.
When I think of efficient players, I put Obi Toppin above Jokic every time. So this is the only stat that matters in the NBA. All right. My one number is actually kind of a couple similar to my bench number. It's a couple numbers that all kind of mean the same thing. And I really wanted to focus on Obi at the 5 for this, because I do wonder about what that is, or what part of the future of Obi Toppin with the Pacers that's a part of. So the number I would start with is 0.01. That is the Pacers' regular season net rating with Obi Toppin on, and none of Turner, Jackson Smith, and I put Tyson there to be thorough, on the floor. Right? That's not very good. Now, let me break that down a little bit, because you'll hear the first number and smile, and then hear the second one and frown, or maybe even throw up. Their offensive rating in the regular season with Obi Toppin at center is amazing, 128.4. Their defensive rating with Obi Toppin at center in the regular season is 128.3. That's awful. And it's kind of reasonable to me for some of the reasons we just talked about, that both of those numbers are actually real. And so is that actually a thing you can rely on, a net neutral lineup situation? Like maybe if they can score at that level, it certainly has utility if it's that good on offense. But is this actually a thing, or did it become a thing because of matchup and need in the postseason? That's what I wonder. And then to build off of that, in the playoffs, the reason it worked is their defense was actually good in those by rating. It was not good in practice. We watched the games. It was a 112 defensive rating in the playoffs, 117.8 on offense. So that's much better. So is that actually a thing? Is it actually better in a playoff setting? Or is it just a small sample thing where, because we saw it in the Celtics series, that lineup could not defend at all. It was useless against Boston. So what that lineup's utility is kind of says a lot about what Toppin can be for this team in the future, because of what they have in the front corner they could have in future seasons.
Can I ask a question that I don't have the number in front of me, but maybe you do?
I'll try to pull it up as fast as possible if I don't. Go ahead.
What were the numbers with Obi at the 5 when Pascal was out there too?
I'm on it.
Without another
playoff, regular season, or both?
Either one.
Okay. Yes. Respond to what I just said while I type that in very quickly.
I think that it was, after game 1 against Milwaukee, I was very adamant that they needed to not play Jalen or Ijax again. Yeah. In part because, Bobby Portis at the 5, Gallinari at the 5, they were doing a lot of switching. it felt like a situation of the Pacers are going to need to go smaller and see if they can outscore those units, which is what it ended up happening. I also felt like it was useful at times, potentially against Boston, with the difference being is I felt like they both underreacted and overreacted to when the Celtics made the adjustment to play O'Shea Brissett at the 5. Like, just because they're playing a spread unit doesn't mean that you need to spread the defense out that far and pay that level of respect to O'Shea when he's standing out beyond the 3-point line. And then meanwhile, they weren't necessarily leveraging their size heavily during those minutes. And it was somewhat telling again that like there's a unit out there with, Pascal, Obi, whoever, and it's Ben Shepherd guarding Jason Tatum instead of either one of them. But like, to your point, there's going to be two things about Obi Toppin in the playoffs that I take away and I'm going to remember and be thinking about if they potentially re-sign and keep Obi Toppin as a restricted free agent. Game 6 against Milwaukee, because that series went from, Pascal in games 1 and 2, really punishing the cross match against Brook Lopez to the point where they put Brook Lopez back on Myles. Then for like the next couple games, it became very much about the Tyrese, Brook Lopez pick and roll threat combination until Doc Rivers was like, hey, we're going to switch everything. And then in that game 6, it became very much about the role players and what Aaron Nesmith and TJ and Obi did because of that. And that was valuable to the Pacers that they had that degree of depth where it's like, hey, we just need to be more egalitarian, get the ball moving against these switches. And those guys showed up when they needed them to the point where we're watching Obi like hit a couple transition threes. We're seeing him make the push shot in the lane. He's running out. He's dribbling uphill and making a pass around Chris Middleton's ear with his left hand, where that's another thing about Obi. He keeps the ball moving very well and connects to the next play as a connector in ways that I don't think he always gets credit for. But then the other thing that sticks out in my mind, as you referenced, is that game 4 against Boston, where the Pacers didn't feel comfortable playing Myles Turner. They took him out with 3:54 to play because of the back stiffness or whatever else was going on. And they went small with Obi and Pascal out there, and 2 possessions in a row. Obi's guarding Al Horford. They went and had Al Horford be the screener so that then they could run high split action, and Obi ends up getting beat. Tatum attacks him in space. He's at the rim. Next possession, Jaylen Brown does exactly the same thing. And like what I mentioned before is that like Siakam is a guy who can defend the screener and switch out to the ball, and you're okay with him and contain. That doesn't necessarily apply to Obi in these situations. So like according to Second Spectrum, when Toppin was the defender switching out as the screener defender in the playoffs, the Pacers gave up 1.136 points per chance. For Siakam, that was 0.813 points per chance. So that series against Boston was going to be tough for Obi because for certain physical limitations, like I told you, it's almost like he doesn't have hips. He's very incredibly athletic at moving in straight lines. He struggles with backward mobility, and especially when he has to change directions with backward mobility. So the Pacers needed to be able to switch. They couldn't really do that with Myles Turner. They couldn't really do it with Obi, but also for necessary reasons because they were struggling to score at the end of those games. They went with Obi rather than Isaiah Jackson because they wanted to be able to still juice their offense, and that didn't play in their favor.
Yeah, in my own head, that's what I would have done. And I said that throughout the series, like I would always be adjusting for offense, but clearly it did not work. And the Celtics, because they're the Celtics and they're the best team, just picked it apart. So to answer the question you asked, there were only 2 minutes that he played at the 5 without Pascal the whole playoff. So basically the numbers I said are exactly the same.
Okay.
In those settings, I actually can't believe there were 2 minutes that happened because I don't remember them. And now I want to figure out what the lineup actually was. In the regular season, if you make sure Pascal's involved, instead of a plus very small net rating, it's 131.4 offensive rating. That's phenomenal. And a 122 defensive rating. So that pairing is very good.
Right.
But what does that mean who isn't in the game is also a question about what that means.
And I mean, and that's in part why I kind of, when we did the center one, I kind of anticipated whenever we were talking about it, that like, hey, Jalen Smith very well might not take his player option because Isaiah already usurped him during the playoff run. And the Pacers felt comfortable enough to be playing Obi/Pascal at this 5 position. And another thing that we didn't necessarily talk about here too is in the Knicks series, Obi was playing a lot at the 3. Like they were playing Isaiah, Pascal, and Obi at the same time.
Together, right.
So they had flexibility offensively with the 2 of them and things that they did. Not necessarily tons of defensive flexibility with either one of them, albeit for much different reasons.
And that's why I wonder about it, because we hinted at it and I've talked about it. Like one way to play Jarris would be Obi at the 5 in the future. Is this actually a tenable thing? Well, with Pascal, it seems like it, but without him, nah, not really. So that is part of, I think, has to be part of their calculus if they do that sort of thing and how they prioritize that. Okay, so to answer a question I just asked myself, would you like to know the 2 lineups that featured Obi at the 5 without Pascal in the postseason?
I'm guessing that it might have been like during garbage time when Jarris was playing, or when they like
one was garbage
Kendall
time.
Brown out there.
One does have Kendall Brown. Okay, this one was not garbage time, but I don't remember it. One was Haliburton, Nembhard, Walker, Shepard, Toppin. That was in game 1, April 23rd against the Bucks. And the other one, yes, was McConnell, Shepard, Walker, Brown, and Toppin. That one is very clearly garbage time. I don't remember this first one at all. I'd have to go back and look. Anyway, that did happen. These are lineups that existed in a postseason setting. Okay, as we do here, when I don't know what to talk about, and it's not that I don't know what to talk about, it's that this is kind of the best indication of, was what they did good enough to firmly plant their flag as a Pacer long-term? Our over-under can be two things. I'll make it the easy one. It's 0.5 contract signed with the Pacers this summer.
I lean the over. I think that they will likely think that he fits their strengths well enough to retain him. And to the front office's credit, obviously you track things about the salary cap and front office moves much more closely than I do. But I can't think of many bad contracts that the Indiana Pacers have signed in this front office's tenure. So I'm guessing it's a reasonable one that will lend them flexibility if they think that they need to make a different move somewhere down the line. That being said, when I was watching that Celtics series, and it certainly is not fair to pair or to pin all of the defensive issues on Obi, even in those late game situations, I can squint my eyes and think of a future where if they were back in that situation again, where if Jarris reaches what you think Jarris can be, that as an archetype, he would have made more sense in some of those lineups. So it's interesting in that regard that maybe what Chad said ends up being correct, that maybe they find a way to play Jarris some at the 3 next year. But I don't think Boston's really going anywhere, and I don't think you necessarily shape your roster around one specific opponent because you may not play that opponent again. But I do think that the Celtics are going to be there, and they need to have a more feasible way to switch, and that was very difficult with Myles and Obi in that series.
Yeah, so to your first point, I mean, all their worst contracts they've had with this front office, because Monte Ellis was the old one, which is noteworthy because that's the worst one they've had in 15 years probably, are ones that they either drafted, like TJ Lee for Goga, or traded for, like Tristan Thompson. That's not even that bad, I guess. Tice, the other Celtics guys they got in that deal. So they don't sign, or they have not signed, and they've shown good restraint too. Bad deals. Probably the worst one they've signed was a 1-year Tyreek Evans deal, right? Like, I just flipped back through all the years that I've had it. I don't know. I'm sure I could pick something else maybe, but like the worst one I thought they ever signed was McConnell's current deal. And that looks awesome, right? Like, this front office has been pretty good with foresight of the deals they've signed. Maybe you could argue McDermott's. I don't know. Anyway, all this to say, I do agree that they are very good at picking and choosing the right battles and setting hard limits when it comes to negotiating. So with Toppin as a restricted free agent, it's hard for me to imagine where it gets too high because he's not in the tier of restricted free agent where teams are like tripping all over themselves for an offer sheet, and offer sheets keep going down and down every year. So it seems like the route to him being on a reasonably priced deal with the Pacers is there. And I kind of think in the Pacers market, if you have a at worst neutral value contract, you keep the player rights, especially if you like the way they fit. And Toppin and Chad Buchanan said the business part matters, but they would like to continue their relationship. And all the reasons they acquired Obi Toppin came to fruition. More also happened. Now, granted, they made it so far, right? The Peter principle comes into play. They made it so far, they got enough promotions that they hit their cap of what Toppin's effectiveness was. So does that deter them from doing it? And then the Jarris Walker factor is the other one of like, right, you just drafted this guy in the lottery. But to me, where Jarris comes in is where you set your price limit, right? Like, if it's such a good deal, then you just do it anyway. So I am with you. I lean over. I think he's a good fit. What I think the most interesting part of Obi's contract will be is how long it is, not how much it is, because maybe he plays well again and he can be unrestricted and get more. Maybe he wants to get to 7 years. I don't know. And he's 26 already. So that is more interesting to me than the number because he's restricted. I will be very curious where it lands. But my current prediction is that it is with the Pacers. So I'll say 1, despite the stuff we talked about.
I mean, I think that the Jarris question with regards to both Pascal and Obi is probably the most interesting one, and especially with Obi's deal, because can you still find ways for him to play? Is he ready to play? Like, I'll be able to provide more of an update on that once I've seen him at Summer League. I think that would be revealing.
Sorry to cut you off, but that's why I brought up the center numbers, because that would be the easiest route, but it might not even exist.
I mean, otherwise you're pretty much probably making a choice between him or Ben Shepherd.
Exactly.
And the second unit. And like I said, they needed somebody who can defend wings and do some switching, which is what you're hoping that at some point Jarris can do. There were spots where that looked decent for the Pacers. Certainly in the game against the Clippers, it looked like something that a role that Jarris will fill. There'll be other games where it looks like he's pretty far from being able to do that. So then it becomes a patience thing. Like right now you have Obi Toppin who suits the things that you do. You just made it to the Eastern Conference Finals. How long are you willing to wait for Jarris to become that? But also, if you re-sign Obi Toppin and you don't find a means for Jarris to play, this is still a need that you have. And you didn't find another way of addressing it. So,
and it'd be very easy for them to say and not be lying, we're trying to win. We're not trying to develop right now. You know, like I'm receptive to that. So then what do you do with the guy you just picked in the lottery last year? Like it's kind of unique about their situation. What makes this conversation fascinating is it's so rare for a team to go lottery conference finals, right? Like that gives your team an odd blend of young development and like, oh, we're good. Like, what do we do now? And I guess this summer, the consequences of that may not come to bear just because their paths are at least pretty simple and don't have a ton of opportunity cost. But like next summer, especially, I think it's going to be like, oh man, you know, what do we do with this reality if they don't do something by then even? So Obi is currently the face of that, but next year the faces of that will be, I don't mean this in any negative way to Obi, but like more consequential pieces of the team. And so that is the interesting contract situation that they're in, and why I asked at X interviews, like, hey, you guys just went from like talking about your long-term planning to like in the final four teams in the league and maybe played the Celtics better than anybody. Like, what do you do? how do you handle this? And I kind of feel like Toppin this summer is the face of it. So that's why sometimes I think the contract stuff can be not a cop out. I don't like to pick them for my over under, even though they are very revealing. But in this case, it is the most important one, I think.
Agreed.
And rant. I have nothing else to add on the power forwards. James Johnson was a great teammate. I have little to add. James Johnson, power forward. He is a great person to be around. I very much enjoy talking to him. Do you have any James Johnson analysis?
I don't, other than I did think it was funny when he wore the security hat, because I did tweet out. I mean, the timing of them bringing him back was quite funny. And at the time when I saw it, I did tweet, looking to beef up the security, it seems. And then he wore.
Look, I understand you might have been working on a deal with James Johnson for a while, but you still did sign him one day after that game happened. Like both things I think are.
The timing of it was amusing, and him wearing the hat was also amusing.
Over under 1.5 security hats worn next season by James Johnson.
Over under meetings with him in Miami to see if.
Well, actually, this time their roster spot situation makes it a lot easier to decide that way before camp. So they want him back. Just get it over with. I have nothing else to add there. Great dude. If they take him back, I totally understand. 4 out of 5, Caitlin. This was great. We'll do point guards for our last one of these, and we'll have it done by next week starting. I keep cashing all my podcasts by saying I have no idea what the schedule is going to be. Now the finals are over, it should be easier, but we haven't, as of this time, heard much on the free agency front. You are adding way more commentary to these, the clips and everything we're saying. Where can people find all of that?
Right. So you can see, if you're watching us on YouTube, my X handle's at C2_Cooper. The link to my Patreon's there, patreon.com/basketballshewrote. And what Tony said is accurate. So I'm doing written blurbs on every player where I think that there's going to be some numbers that you're going to see in those paragraphs that you aren't going to find anywhere else. And then just addressing some of the things that you're going to see in the clips, especially like if you didn't fully follow my explanation of what they were doing on some of those empty side pick and rolls. I've annotated some of it to give greater in-depth explanation, because that in fact was my favorite play of the playoffs for the reasons that I laid out. So that's unlocked because I want people to be able to read that in addition to watching these videos. So head over there. That's the content plan for June. And then if I'm lucky, I'm going to try to twist Tony's arm to come over and do my monthly mailbag with me next week.
Got to get my treats in order. Yeah, sometimes I feel like when I'm describing like Obi Toppin shot faking for people, I'm like, do I sound like the adults in Charlie Brown to people listening to this podcast right now? Just a horn sound of nothing because you can't actually see what I'm saying, but people really do seem to enjoy these. Check out Caitlin's Patreon for everything, even beyond this series. As a paid subscriber, I cannot recommend it enough. And I love that it comes to my email because I used to be a tabs guy for reading and I hated it. And emailing has changed my life. I just said this, but tomorrow we'll see. You might be getting this episode. You might be getting another player review episode. You might be getting they signed this guy episode. We'll see. Follow Caitlin's work. I'm on X or whatever at Tony R East, sharing nonsense there about the Fever and Pacers since the NBA is done. Get into the W. It's a fun season for it. Thank you all for listening today. Have a wonderful day. See you very soon.